Taylor Frankie Paul did not just catch another ugly headline. This video is about how a temporary custody order, an active investigation, a production pause, and a last-minute Disney Entertainment television cancellation stacked up so quickly that her public image took one of the hardest hits reality TV has seen in years. Within a matter of days, old footage came rushing back. ABC pulled her Jesse Palmer-hosted season of The Bachelorette only 3 days before it was set to air. Filming on the secret lives of Mormon wives stopped in Utah, and the custody update pushed the story into a far heavier lane than ordinary influencer mess. Everything tightened at once. The result was a scandal that no longer felt limited to MomTok or reality show gossip, because every new piece of reporting seemed to hit a different part of her life and pull the whole thing wider. Drop your take in the comments on whether this had been building for a long time, or whether the old footage changed the story the second it resurfaced. Hit like now if you want more celebrity breakdowns that move fast and stay clear, because the problem here was never just one rumor, one fight, or one bad week. What nobody expected was how many pieces would fall at the same time, which meant family, television, cast relationships, and brand fallout all started feeding the same story instead of sitting in separate lanes. That changed everything. Once a scandal starts crossing from court issues to production decisions to sponsor reactions, viewers stop seeing one person's drama and start watching a full public breakdown that feels bigger every time a fresh detail lands. For anyone catching up, Taylor Frankie Paul had already become one of those figures whose private life and public brand were tied together so tightly that one always affected the other. MomTok gave her a huge platform. The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives placed her in the middle of a reality show built on image, friendship, and tension, alongside cast members like Whitney Leavitt and Macy Neely, and Dakota Mortensen had already become part of the public storyline around her, which meant any conflict connected to him carried more weight than it would have for a celebrity whose personal life stayed mostly off camera. That setup mattered. The problem was that her audience was already used to seeing the emotional part of her life treated as content, so once serious headlines returned, the fallout did not stay in the private lane for even a second. Instead, it slid straight into the machine that turns real problems into public judgment, and that made every update hit harder. The older case is where the groundwork for this week's collapse had already been laid, and that history came back at the worst possible time. Back in 2023, Taylor Frankie Paul was arrested after an altercation involving Dakota Mortensen, later entered a plea in abeyance on an aggravated assault charge in Utah courts, and saw the other charges dismissed, which left a legal episode sitting in the background even after the noise died down. Then the footage resurfaced. None of that stayed old news once viewers could match that earlier incident to a fresh wave of reporting. And that is why the tone changed so quickly, because people were no longer reacting to a new scandal in isolation. They were attaching it to a case they already remembered, a visual they could now see again, and a public figure whose image had never fully separated from chaos. That connection sharpened the reaction fast, which meant the current fallout landed on top of baggage that had never really cleared. The current investigation made the whole thing much harder to shrink into a story about past mistakes. And this is where the pressure turned current, active, and impossible to dodge. Draper City Police confirmed there is an open domestic assault investigation involving both Taylor Frankie Paul and Dakota Mortensen after contact with both parties on February 24 and 25, and allegations were made in both directions, which meant this was not just the internet digging up history for clicks. A live issue was sitting underneath it. Taylor Frankie Paul publicly described the moment as a heavy time and said she would speak her truth when the time is right, while also confirming that production on The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives had been paused, and that mattered because a paused show tells the audience something immediately. Cameras do not stop for nothing. The result was a story that could no longer be framed as one old clip causing drama, because the legal cloud was still hanging there in the present and pulling the whole narrative forward. Then the custody update landed, and this is the point where the entire scandal started sounding darker, even to people who had never watched a second of MomTok. Entertainment Weekly reported that Dakota Mortensen was granted a temporary restraining order against Taylor Frankie Paul, along with temporary custody of their son, with a hearing set for April 7th in Salt Lake County Court. And once that detail reached the public, the language around the story changed almost instantly. Family court hits differently. Plenty of people online shortened that into "she lost custody," but the more accurate version still carried enough force on its own, because temporary custody pending a hearing is not the kind of update viewers brush off as routine celebrity drama. What nobody needed explained was the weight of those words. Court orders, a child, and an April 7 hearing gave the scandal a hard center, which meant the conversation jumped from messy reality TV chatter into something that felt heavier, colder, and much more difficult to spin. The so-called Mormon Wives expose angle added another layer, and what made it hit was not one dramatic sit-down or one cast member unloading in public. Reports pointed instead to a coordinated pullback, with Michaela Matthews saying the season 5 pause was a group decision because the cast did not feel comfortable filming. Jesse and Dakota pushing back against the idea that jealousy over the Bachelorette caused the tension, and sources saying the women were distancing themselves from Taylor Frankie Paul. That kind of silence is loud. The result was a freeze-out that looked more serious than ordinary reality show infighting, because none of that sounded like petty cast rivalry or a simple clash over attention. What nobody around her seemed interested in doing was shielding her from the moment, which meant viewers were left watching us circle close ranks by stepping away rather than leaning in. Public statements from around the show made that distance even harder to ignore, and this is where the mood around the story turned away from gossip and toward consequence. Layla Taylor and Miranda McWhorter both shared messages condemning domestic violence and centering concern on the children involved, which shifted the conversation from who was feuding with whom to whether the entire situation had crossed into territory too serious for ordinary reality TV framing. That move mattered. The problem was that once people connected to the show start using language about safety, children, and harm, the scandal stops reading like spectacle and starts reading like liability. And networks, castmates, and advertisers tend to react very differently when the tone moves in that direction. What nobody could miss was the pattern, because production was paused, cast members were creating distance, and public support had started looking much harder to find than it once did. March 19, 2026, became the date that pushed the whole thing from niche fallout into mainstream entertainment damage, because Disney Entertainment Television announced through ABC that it would not move forward with Taylor Frankie Paul's season of The Bachelorette and said its focus was supporting the family. 3 days later, on March 22, that season had been supposed to premiere. That timing was brutal. Contestants had already been revealed, promotion was already in motion, and the show was close enough to air that pulling it at that stage looked less like a quiet change in plans and more like an emergency stop by a network that no longer wanted to carry the risk. None of that stayed inside her fan bubble. Once a major dating franchise yanks its lead at the last possible moment, people far outside the MomTok world start paying attention, which meant her story no longer belonged only to followers, cast watchers, or gossip channels. It had become mainstream entertainment news with one decision. The ripples from that decision widened the damage because Taylor Frankie Paul was no longer the only person absorbing the fallout. Reports said some contestants felt betrayed. Warner Brothers reportedly met with 21 of the 22 men and told them their contracts would remain active for a year, and ABC filled the planned premiere slot with a rerun of American Idol, which turned the story into an industry problem instead of a single star's crisis. Schedules moved, contracts stayed alive, airtime got rewritten. The estimated financial impact reportedly reached $40.50 million for the network. Then brand fallout arrived right behind it, with Cinnabon cutting ties with a campaign linked to Taylor Frankie Paul, The Bachelorette, and The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, saying the situation no longer matched its brand values, while separate reporting said the last-minute cancellation could cost ABC millions beyond that initial estimate. Money changes the mood fast. The result was a scandal that had moved past online noise and into the places where studios, networks, and advertisers start making cold decisions about exposure, cost, and damage control. Another reported detail made the timeline look even worse for her, because it suggested concern had been building before the public ever saw the full blow-up. People, citing NBC News reporting on audio from a meeting with ABC executives earlier in March, said cast members from The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives had already raised safety concerns, discomfort around filming, and worries about the brand, while the investigation was already hanging over everything. And that detail matters because it changes the shape of the cancellation. It stops looking sudden. What nobody can call it after that is random, because the network decision starts to read like the final response to a problem that had been forming in private long before it exploded in public. That shift is hard to undo, since viewers begin to see the public collapse not as one bad week, but as the moment earlier warnings finally caught up with the biggest project tied to her name. That is why this story feels larger than ordinary influencer chaos, because each update lands in a different corner of Taylor Frankie Paul's life and makes the overall picture harder to contain. One development affects her family situation, another cracks her cast relationships, another wipes out a network opportunity, another cuts into brand deals, and another raises questions about what people around her had already been saying behind closed doors. Everything connects. The problem was never just the headline of the day, because the weight came from the stack. A temporary custody bombshell, an open investigation, a halted production, cast distance, a canceled dating show, sponsor fallout, and a public image that suddenly looked much more fragile than it did a week earlier. Even with the legal process still moving and the April 7 hearing still ahead, the public damage is already here. For Taylor Frankie Paul, that may end up being the hardest part of all, because the court side is not finished, but the image shift has already happened in plain view. The investigation remains open, the hearing is still coming, and the legal outcome has not been finalized, yet her reality TV future now looks far less stable than it did before this pileup of events hit all at once. What nobody can deny is how quickly the narrative changed. A figure once tied to visibility, audience access, and constant online attention is now attached to court orders, a production halt, cast separation, and a major franchise pulling back just days before launch. And that contrast is what keeps the story moving across so many audiences. Leave your take below on whether this was the week her public image finally broke, or whether one path back still exists once the legal process plays out. Subscribe for more celebrity breakdowns that keep the facts straight, keep the pace tight, and focus on the details that actually move the story.